Alright, this is a special one. Alright? Vampires, hypocrites, and parasites. Uruguay! Rest in peace, Muammar al-Gaddafi, my hero. I cry. Gaddafi is gone. Oh no. Ow.
Good afternoon and welcome to part 2 of Despot's Bookshelf 2-part special on Colonel Gaddafi's The Green Book. Gaddafi was once referred to by Ronald Reagan as the mad dog of the Middle East, which I think's a descriptor not entirely unfair given his penchant for random acts of violence and terrorism, and the odd desire to promote nuclear weapons while living in a tent in the desert. None of which sort of engenders a lot of sanity, I think. Gaddafi, though, as we explored in the last episode, and if you haven't listened to the last episode, listen to that one before you listen to this one. Gaddafi did have some thoughts on economic theory and political theory, and in this episode, on social theory. Now, in the last episode, I think we came to the distressing conclusion that his critique of existing democratic politics and of capitalist economic theory was not entirely without merit. In this episode, we're going to discuss his views on social theory, and I don't want to preempt the content, but they are pretty wild. With me to discuss these wild theories, I have Jack Banner.
Hello.
Chris Whitwood.
Hello there.
And Jack Carrington.
Snowball, snowball.
Let's begin with you, Chris. Can you define for us what he sees as the hierarchy of society? And I will declare an interest before you begin to speak. For me, his discussion on societal hierarchies is probably the only bit of his assessment of society and this book which made any sense. So tell us about that.
Well, his hierarchy of society sort of echoes his ingenious solution for solving the problems inherent with democracy, which actually I think was only a few steps short of sortition. He believed that the family was the central unit of society, and then as families procreate and expand, they become tribes, and they are united not by family ties, but by tribalism. And then as tribes procreate and expand, they become nations, which are bound together by nationalism. And then the whole world is bound together by humanity. But as you go up each step of the hierarchy, those bonds tying everyone together weaken.
I think a quote from it is that nationalism is a natural law, which I found strange because I'm pretty sure later on in his reign, he was a pan-Arabist. Is that right?
No, he was a pan-Arabist early, and then he became pan-African later. In fact, you may see in the later photos, his tailor was clearly in overdrive, and he wore these like long robes with giant symbols of the African continent scattered all over them.
I love the ones where he had like a photograph of African leaders pinned to his chest as a badge.
Because, of course, in the early 70s, Libya was known as the Libyan Arab Republic. It was almost Ba'athist in its integrationist desires with the rest of the Arab world, to hark back to Saddam. You know, it was propagating these ideas you got from Nasser of Libya being one state within an Arab superstate. And by the 90s, he'd fallen off a cliff. I think he decided the Arab leaders didn't like him because he was a lunatic. And so Africa may be easier prey for his lunacy.
It did go quite far. So, for example, Libya and Syria signed just a bit of paper, but basically declaring that they were actually one single state and nation together. He also was in quite advanced talks with unification with Tunisia as well. I think that kind of fell off a cliff where you realise, wait a minute, there's 5 million Libyans and like 9 million Tunisians. Who's going to be in charge of this new state? Realised it wasn't going to be him and decided to row back on it. But yeah, he's forever been looking to in some way expand.
I just find it astonishing that the Green Book contains a contradiction.
I think it's quite interesting that he picks up on why the map of the world changes and why different large empires rise and fall and are broken apart into small nations and then coagulate again into larger empires. And he says that the state is not a social structure like the family, the tribe and the nation, but rather a political entity created by several factors. So the idea that these nation states, so if you think of, for example, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, where there's multiple nations now where that is, not just like Austria and Hungary, but places like Czech Republic, Slovakia, Slovenia, Croatia. Gaddafi described each of those groups as nations bound together by nationalism. But for whatever reason, at a point in the history of those nations, there becomes a political force that brings them all together into a political entity and an empire, and then they revert to what he saw as their natural state as individual nations again.
And there was this really interesting bit of nationalist thinking. And, once again, like when I read the first two books, the books on politics and the economy, I read the first few pages and thought, you know what, this is actually quite an interesting analysis. And I did this here as well. On one occasion, because I think as a Westerner, as someone who lives in Western Europe, I didn't get where tribe fit in to this notion of societal development. And his explanation that the nation is the political umbrella, which gives us all the security that the nation brings, but the tribe is the social umbrella, and the tribe looks after things like education and socialising people and making people members of society. It was almost like the nation did the politics while the tribe did the social and the sense of belonging. I thought that was actually an interesting stab at defining an issue which I didn't really have much of an understanding of. Did anyone else think that?
I think that's really interesting, but then if we go back and compare that to the third universal theory with all the people's committees and the people's congresses, that doesn't make sense at all.
I suggest, well, this is, of course, another bit, an equal bit of the third universal theory ban, and you are once again not suggesting that Gaddafi's thinking may have been muddled, are you?
I'm worried for my own sanity.
Do you not think that there is some sort of logic is such a strong word, but you can follow the thought process through. You have a decision made as a family group, and then that each family group makes a decision amongst their tribe, and then each tribe comes together and makes a decision for the nation. Does that sort of tiered structure not model the basic and non-basic people's conferences?
But I don't have my notes from the last episode in front of me, dear comrade.
Expression of professionalism right there from Chairman Arnie Craven.
Why would I? However, I do believe he's quite down on the idea of tribes in terms of mechanisms for decision making, and does suggest that tribal politics is very damaging to the cohesion of a society in terms of politics.
He does seem to flip on this quite a bit.
But you legitimately do see the flipping. You see this throughout. He goes from being an Arab nationalist to an African nationalist. He goes from anti-tribal politics to pro-tribal politics in the same book.
I think what's particularly worth noting is, and this comes out through his description of minorities as well, Gaddafi had an underdog complex. This is why you see him linked to all sorts of horrendous acts of terror, whether it's the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, whether it's the bombing of La Belle nightclub. But the reason he was sponsoring all of these terrorist organisations was because he had a belief in the underdog, and so he ended up forming links with the IRA in the UK, with the Red Army faction in Germany, Black Panther movement in the US, the ANC in South Africa, to a point that he was so close to Mandela that one of Mandela's grandsons is called Gaddafi.
Cool name, though.
Gaddafi Bannon. What a child name for you, Bannon.
That'll be my heir.
But what he defaulted to backing the underdog, regardless of whether the wider community thought they were right or not.
So the ultimate test would be, did he immediately stop supporting the ANC as soon as they regained power, and then just started funding some random sort of Afrikaner racist group instead?
He just starts walking around in a white hood.
Oh, what was the Afrikaner nationalist movement that invaded one of the... when South Africa had apartheid and the apartheid government split off the economically valueless bits of South Africa into pseudo-states, homelands. Yeah. There was that Afrikaner nationalist movement, and I think we should maybe do an episode on it. Channel 4 did a good documentary about the guy who ran it. Their flag was literally the Nazi flag.
Is it Eugene Terreblanche?
Yes, Eugene Terreblanche. Incredible.
What a pronunciation.
Didn't he used to ride around on his horse and beat farmhands with a stick?
I believe he was a character, to say the least.
I love the niche level of this conversation.
That's what you get at The Hague. You're put on trial for being a character.
Anyway, I think what we've done there is had a good stab at trying to find some reason in what ultimately is one of the... And I don't want to say insane in the way that the North Korean works insane, or the way that Saddam's stuff on democracy just seemed to lack a sense of irony, or Armin was just all over the place. I think this is insane in a very different way, in a drug-induced way. This book was like reading the ramblings of someone who consumed some substance. Some illicit substance. So where do we begin? I think I'm going to begin with a statement which I bolded in my notes. Bear in mind this is supposed to be a seminal work of political philosophy. It is an undisputed fact that both man and woman are human beings. Discuss, please.
I mean, it's a good place to start. The fact that he follows it up with that women and men are equal as human beings, and discrimination against women by men is a flagrant act of oppression without justification. And you think, oh, Gaddafi the feminist. And then you read on.
It was like at each point I'd written down what I thought was the killer Gaddafi the misogynist quote. I'd get to the next paragraph and I'd just cross it out going like, nope, it's this one now. And that happened for just page after page. I've just literally got just half-completed quotes just going on and on as he just gets more... just falls off the cliff. I think my favourite had to be, according to gynecologists, a woman menstruates every month. Like, there's just... What are the women in his life that he clearly does not talk to in any way?
It's the fact he just summarises like a year 9 science textbook, but then concludes it with "end of gynecological statement" with an exclamation mark.
Which I think is the perfect way to end any statement on anything.
But don't overlook what comes immediately before "end of gynecological statement." Just this is the leader of a nation who insisted that everyone in the country read this book and tried to propagate this theory across the globe. Who immediately before saying "end of gynecological statement!" exclamation mark simply wrote, "The man, on the other hand, neither conceives nor breastfeeds." This comes barely pages after his assessment of democracy, after his quite intelligent assessment of democracy.
Yeah, I've watched a very interesting documentary on Channel 5 in which a man did breastfeed. End of gynecological statement.
Exclamation mark.
I believe the condition is known as gynecomastia, for anyone else who is worried because they've just started leaking.
Can we further reflect on his view that nurseries are akin to poultry farms?
There is just a whole bit, generally in the woman part, about just anything that is not your natural position, natural thing. Motherhood is for motherhood is for women. They should be at home. And even though they might think they want to do manual labour, they don't really. They're just deluded, they're just under a spell, they don't really want it. They should be at the home, nurseries are terrible.
The belief, even if it is held by a woman, that she carries out physical labour of her own accord is not in fact true.
What it came across as is, Gaddafi, your mum sent you to a nursery and you didn't like it. And there's an echo of this in the education bit as well, where it just goes, but you have to learn this curriculum and you can't choose what you want to learn, like petulant child. Just echoing down into adulthood was a lot of the content of the social theory.
The other thing I really liked about and there's gold, frankly, you could spend hours and hours talking about the woman section of the book. I don't know if anyone picked up on this, because he only does it occasionally. Did anyone pick up on what he uses as a synonym for the word house?
I have this in quotes. In fact, I was saving it for what's your favourite quote of the whole book.
Can we do this now? Because I am expunging the word house from my vocabulary. I do not live in a house anymore, Carrington. In what do I live?
The female is the owner of the maternity shelter, which is the house. Females, they've got the houses. They do child rearing, therefore they have to own the house. That's done and dusted.
I'm sorry, Carrington. They do not own the house. Let's be accurate.
The maternity shelter.
End of gynecological statement.
Moving on from that, Jack Bannon.
Yes.
Black people will prevail in the world. Discuss.
Oh my God. Well,
for those listening,
Jesus,
that is the title of a chapter.
all right. And tightrope. So,
Throwing you under a bus there.
Gaddafi he contends that the future is one that will be dictated by black people, basically. And his idea behind this is thus: because in sub-Saharan Africa, numbers of children produced are higher than they are in the Western world, Africa will have a numerical superiority in the future, and that as a result, the future will be black. But he also speckles this speech with various dog whistle racist comments about how black people haven't prevailed to the current day because they are less obsessive about work due to their subtropical conditions.
Do you want the quote?
Yes, please.
Go on then.
Black people are now in a very backward social situation, but such backwardness works to bring about their numerical superiority because their low standard of living has shielded them from methods of birth control and family planning. The population of other races has decreased because of birth control restrictions on marriage and constant occupation in work, unlike the blacks who tend to be less obsessive about work in a climate which is continuously hot. I feel like he needs to quote Idi Amin saying, "I wish to emphasise I am not a racist."
I like to think that he wrote that wearing a gaudy Hawaiian shirt emblazoned with the face of Nelson Mandela.
I'm just checking this now. I think I had this in my notes somewhere. Was Gaddafi? Yes, he was. Yes, the man who wrote this later became chairman of the African Union. What could you possibly do that's bad enough to disqualify you from being chairman of the African Union if this doesn't rule you out?
I mean, at least he's showing he's kind of got faith that Africa will prevail. I don't know. I'm clutching at straws here.
Idi Amin was chairman of the Proto-African Union, and he reportedly ate people. So I think there's a pretty low bar.
Maybe it's a thing about keeping dead people in their fridge.
I think it's almost there's like a madness criteria, like it's a qualification statement to become leader of the African Union. That if they've basically gone just like, hey, all publicity is good publicity. We need to put Africa on the world stage. Who's the biggest nutcase around? Go sell Africa.
Now, we have discussed, I think, about as much as we should in terms of Gaddafi's views on race. And I hate to bring people's professional life into this podcast. However, Chris Whitwood, I don't think I am sharing anything you'd be embarrassed about. He looks very nervous on the webcam.
Terrified.
You are indeed a qualified school teacher, Chris. He's got a very interesting view on education, doesn't he? When you were trained to be a teacher, were you really being trained to suppress the freedom of the youth?
Oh, I mean, all the time. The quote, "to force a human being to learn according to a set curriculum is a dictatorial act," is just layered with so much irony, given the fact that this book was part of the school curriculum. He forced children to learn all of this. But I did particularly like that he expressed that despite his hatred of set curriculums and his dislike for state-funded education, he didn't mean that schools are to be closed and people should, reject education out of hand, as it may seem to superficial readers, which I felt like burn.
What I like about this is that if you take that quote in isolation and put it with some of his other ideas about kids should basically be allowed to choose whatever they want to learn, and put it in the mouth of some kind of like far out hippie in San Francisco, it would sound absolutely reasonable.
I mean, he is skirting around the edges of like the Steiner or Montessori system. It's the undertone of, as Carrington picked up on earlier, I had a bad experience as a child, therefore I want to make sure that all Libyan children do exactly what I say.
Mummy sent me to nursery and they made me learn maths.
Wouldn't it be weird if all Montessori schools around the world were actually secretly run by Muammar Gaddafi?
Conspiracy. That's a conspiracy we need to tweet about, chaps. I was very interested in Gaddafi's real desire to see sports stadiums be demolished, and how he saw the demolition of sports stadiums as a big step towards societal development. Does anyone want to take on explaining why that was?
Basically, he believed that sport wasn't real sport unless you participate. Like, the idea of being a spectator was just this horrid thing to be looked down on, and that in whatever situation, you should be participating. You can't have the achievements of others. The idea that any stadium is used for just one people, just like, no, you shouldn't have the stands. You shouldn't separate it out. And all these public stadiums will go out of use because everyone else will just be playing elsewhere. So it was a weird free market idea that it was just going to starve them
His
out.
belief was that professional sports teams and professional athletes somehow had a monopoly on sport and were therefore preventing other people doing it. It's like, because Manchester United exist, that means the rest of Manchester can't go down to Old Trafford for a kickabout and are therefore just getting fat and lazy at home because they can't use Old Trafford.
So this is a long quote, but I was really enthusiastic about just how much he seemed to hate the idea of a spectator, of a sport, of someone who actually goes and sees sport. And the quote, I just think is brilliant. Those who are unable to perform the roles of heroism in life, who are ignorant of the events of history, who fall short of envisaging the future, and who are not serious enough in their own lives, are the trivial people who fill the seats of the theatres and cinemas. I just imagine, like, if you like the MD of Cineworld reading this, you'd be sweating. You'd be thinking Libyan expansion is off the table. Off the table.
I just like the idea of consumption of media of any kind is just complete. So I don't know if he thinks there should be, like, the Green Book should have just a stack of blank pages at the end, because if you're not helping to write it, you're just a spectator and you're worthless. And also just like, oh, look at the grandkids having a kickabout in the back garden. No, Ethel, get out there, join them, or you're worthless.
It's just such a rant at the end because, I mean, it just stops after this. There's no conclusion. There's no rationale or grand idea to summarise. But it's just like a stream of consciousness. And he goes on from talking about how everyone should participate in sport, and then has a single paragraph where he talks about theatre and says, Bedouin people show no interest in theatres and shows because they are very serious and industrious. And then he goes on to talking about wrestling and boxing, which, like, you just throw in a bit about, like, oh, he hates theatre, by the way, and now boxing is for savages.
I think someone at the nursery probably took him to see a play as an educational thing.
He did have some interesting things to say about minorities as well, didn't he, Carrington?
Well, in the 3-paragraph chapter on minorities, he does stray a bit. There's a quote that just goes, "The political and economic problems of minorities can only be solved within a society controlled by the masses, in whose hands power, wealth and arms should be placed." So it was an interesting pro-Second Amendment call from Gaddafi there, but also, again, the irony of dictators, because in many ways he kept the Libyan army so small that actually his hired mercenaries were larger than the official military of the nation, so that he could never be assumed from power in the way that he was from the previous regime.
How big was his Amazonian bodyguard, which I know Arnie mentioned earlier, but he had some very specific criteria for his private bodyguard, that they were all tall, they must all have long hair, they must be beautiful, and I watched one documentary and it described them as, but these weren't normal women, these were virgin.
Not for long with Gaddafi around.
Well, yeah. I mean, the man had orgies that were inspirational to Silvio Bunga Bunga Berlusconi.
Please never again say bunga bunga in front of me, Whit. That is. Oh, in fact, I'm not going to do a Dawn French joke during the conversation.
Bunga Bunga.
So, I think we've given a good stab to the Green Book there. But now I think, as we do with all of our episodes, it's important for us to really try to get to the nub of what the author was saying with our favourite quote. So I'll begin with you, Carrington. What was your favourite quote from any of the 3 books of Gaddafi's seminal work?
I'm going to go for something that's a bit straying out into agriculture and nourishment. Meat from mechanised poultry farms is not tasty and may not be nourishing because the chicks are not naturally bred and are not raised in the protective shade of natural motherhood. End of gynecological statement.
Poultry. A poultry assessment there from Colonel Carrington. Colonel Whitwood?
I'm going to go for the profound statement that women are females and men are males.
You've stolen mine. That's outrageous. Colonel Bannon?
I would have to say a woman weeps easily and is easily frightened.
Especially when Gaddafi's around.
Men, being male, do not menstruate. So, we have taken 2 episodes to get through the Green Book. And I'm now going to come to you all for the big question. Taking all 3 chapters together, economy, politics, and society, using our 1 to 5 basket case scale, 1 being relatively sane as far as these things go, 5 being off the wall, where does Gaddafi's Green Book sit? And I will begin with Carrington.
I think for the number of factual scientific statements that were incorrect, which really gives meat to the bones of the non-sanity, let's say, I'm going to go with a solid 4 point something. I might round down. I know we've got some good stuff to go in future episodes, so I don't want to overuse it.
4, then.
Yeah, 4.
Banner?
I was close to being a Gaddafi sympathiser in the last episode from parts 1 and 2. I think part 3 has really tipped him much more into the basket case territory. So I'm going to go from 1 basket all the way up to 3 baskets for Gaddafi.
Whitwood?
I've got to echo Bannon. His assessment of the issues around democracy and economics, bang on. His proposals, little bit out there, little bit unworkable. But then, book 3, he just falls off a cliff. It's got to be 3 baskets from me.
Thanks, Chris. I think I'm not in a massively dissimilar place. There's a pleasant uniformity here in that I've been writing down repeatedly 20/80, and I think about 20% of this is actually good. And I say that, better than much political academia I read, more cutting than many, say, journal articles or actual good bits of Western political assessment. About 20% of it is really good, and then the rest is just lunacy. And I'm struggling to get my head around someone who can really succinctly identify some issues with representative democracy and challenge Edmund Burke.
I mean, Edmund Burke is a tosser.
Well, perhaps, but at the same time, thinks it's insightful to write the words, a woman, being female, is naturally subject to monthly bleeding, and then uses dictatorial power to force everyone in the country he rules to read that. And as such, I think I need to find a balance, and I'm going to actually give this a 4, which I think gives us an overall rating of 3.5 for the Green Book. And on that note, I would like to thank our listeners for bearing with us through this strange special 2-episode recording of Despot's Bookshelf. We hope you enjoyed our insight, or lack of insight, into Colonel Gaddafi. And we hope you will listen to our next episode, which should be very exciting. It's the one I'm looking forward to very much. But for now, it's goodbye from me. Goodbye from you guys.
Goodbye.
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 End of gynecological statement. Goodbye, all.
Alright, this is a special one. Alright?
Bunga bunga.
Vampires, hypocrites, and parasites. Uruguay! Rest in peace, Muammar al-Gaddafi, my hero. cry.
Gaddafi is gone. Oh no.
Ow.
Gaddafi.